welcome to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longrie. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is brought to you live from the SCC studios out of White Bear Lake. And through our cooperative agreement, this program is also simultaneously broadcast to those studios out of the Roseville viewing area, the CTV studios. Comcast, should the big get bigger? Now, with our program here on Off the Record News, we are going to be showing quite a few clips, some of them from a few years back, and then some recent clips to help bring a little perspective to this issue about whether or not Comcast should merge with Time Warner. And it is an issue that we've been hearing about in the news, but with Off the Record News, we have the opportunity of actually going into the topic for a whole hour and not just focus on the sound bites. Now, I want to first start off with some film footage from Senator Franken. And this is recent footage from about a month ago where he has clearly stated what his position is.
In this hearing, what we're talking about today is a $45 billion deal that would combine the nation's biggest and the nation's second biggest cable companies and the nation's biggest and the nation's third biggest internet service providers. There is no doubt that Comcast is a huge influential corporation, and I understand there are over 100 lobbyists making the case for this deal to members of Congress and our staffs. But I've also heard from over 100,000 consumers who oppose this deal. And I think their voices need to be heard too. As members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, we are here to question whether this deal is good for competition and whether it's in the public interest. I'm against this deal because I believe it does not meet either test. I believe this deal will result in fewer choices, higher prices, and even worse service for my constituents. Comcast has argued that there's nothing to worry about here because it doesn't compete with Time Warner Cable in any zip code. Mr. Cohn has told reporters, quote, there is absolutely no competitive overlap between the two companies, none, unquote. What he's really saying is that these two companies, each of which controls many of their own local markets, want to become one larger company that controls the national market. The new Comcast would operate in 19 of the nation's 20 biggest markets, 27 of the top 30, as Mr. Bosworth said. That kind of expansion has a serious impact on competition. For example, when Comcast wanted to acquire NBC Universal, Comcast's CEO told this committee not to worry about it because there were still other, quote, robust distributors. And he specifically named Time Warner Cable, which would prevent Comcast from setting anti-competitive prices for NBC content. The point was that Comcast couldn't get away with that sort of behavior because the distributors, including Time Warner Cable, wouldn't stand for it, and they could go to the FCC to complain about it too. Later in the hearing, Comcast CEO also assured us, quote, we are not getting any larger in cable distribution here, unquote. Well, if this deal goes through, Comcast will become larger in cable distribution, and if this deal goes through, Comcast never again will have to negotiate with Time Warner Cable when it comes to setting prices for NBC content. And NBC content, everyone should remember, is 20-some networks.
Always beware when the large corporation and conglomerate says, don't worry, everything's okay. Now, in that clip, there were several facts that I think are important to highlight. One, the number of lobbyists that have been employed in this issue to persuade Congress that the Time Warner Comcast merger is A-OK. How can the citizens, you and I, compete against all those lobbyists and all that money. All we can do is hope that our congresspeople have the sense about them to ask the appropriate questions, to remember what the past has been, and to be inquisitive and to also be skeptical of what they're being told. Senator Franken talked about what had happened in the past. Now, those of you who watch this program on a regular basis and watch some of the other programs on public access channels here know that one of the techniques that we use as citizens on these programs is to bring forward film footage of incidences and discussions that happened years in the past to be able to put a context on the discussions that are going on today, to understand whether or not there have been insider discussions going on, whether or not if somebody or some organization is saying, well, quite frankly, the opposite of what they just said only a few years ago. And I'm heartened that Senator Franken has brought out some of the dialogue of what was discussed at past hearings years ago by Comcast, and then brings it back today to say, you know, this is contrary to what we are hearing them say today. That's an important point. And this issue of the Comcast merger is important to us here locally because, well, quite frankly, all of our cable companies or cable public access studios rather, cable commissions are in the process of negotiating their franchise agreement with Comcast, who has now spun us off, from what I understand, to Charter. And you'll hear a little bit about this in the upcoming film footage that we'll hear that they talk a little bit about that on Capitol Hill. Now, let's continue with hearing the rest of Senator Franken's remarks.
Comcast can't have it both ways. It can't say that the existence of competition among distributors, including Time Warner Cable, was a reason to approve the NBC deal in 2010 and then turn around a few years later and say that the absence of competition with Time Warner Cable is a reason to approve this deal. Mr. Kimmelman, what do you make of Comcast's argument that they don't compete against each other at all? Doesn't that really underestimate the anti-competitive implications of this deal?
Absolutely, Senator Franken. It is true they don't overlap geographically, but that is not the entire competitive analysis either for the Department of Justice or for the Federal Communications Commission. The question here is, are there ways in which they can leverage unfairly? Do they have excess market power? Can they drive up prices? Can they harm quality and innovation? And there are numerous ways in which they can do that. If Time Warner can no longer discipline their pricing for NBC programming, prices will go up there. They probably will go up across the entire distribution chain, harming consumers everywhere. Having the additional leverage of Time Warner as part of the Comcast family gives them enormous power over how the internet develops the ability to offer new innovative services, what devices, what consumer interfaces work. If they have almost half of the customers in the country, that's what manufacturers will make products for that half, meet their specifications. If they continue to want that to be through a bundled, high-priced set of services, I'm sure it will be. These are all enormous dangers that have significant competitive impacts and tremendous harm for consumers.
Well, speaking of bundled services, we'll get to that later. I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman,
this idea of competition, as you heard, the analysis isn't just looking at one area of competition. Is it geographic? That it actually goes beyond that, and you have to broaden that analysis of talking about competition, because if they have the best markets, and that is where they have their control. Well, you see, that has a different effect upon competition than if their market primarily was in those areas where there was less density, for instance. Now, they don't really get to this issue of bundled services because later on in that Senate hearing they do, and we don't have film footage on that at this show. However, bundled services is also another way to squelch competition, because if a company such as Comcast has bundled services where you can get your cable TV, you get your internet, and you can get your phone service, they are more likely to give you a much better deal on that bundled service. But if you only want to take and select out only the internet, for instance, then it's a much higher price. Well, the little company that's coming into the market who is not able to provide bundled services but wants to provide just one of the services that's in the Comcast bundle, they are not necessarily able to compete against the ability of Comcast to provide bundled services. And so you can see that's another aspect of competition that has to be looked at. Now, let's step back a bit. A few years ago, talking about bundled services, a few years ago, the FCC, they went around the country and had open forums so that they could take testimony from citizens about the importance of net neutrality. Now, you hear a lot about net neutrality, and how does that actually play into this whole concept about whether or not Comcast should merge with Time Warner? Well, again, it goes to that control over the internet and over the ability of Comcast or any other big conglomerate to be able to control the access and the platform to that internet. And in past shows, a long time ago, we showed some film footage from that hearing. And I went back and I looked at some of the comments that citizens made, and I pulled out a few new clips from that film footage that we have that's from the uptake. And the First Lady, she talks about how to think about net neutrality. So for those of you who hear that word and you're thinking, but what does net neutrality mean to me as a citizen? Well, let's listen to this lady and how she describes it with an analogy that I think pretty much gets to the point.
Hi, my name is Sarah Reynolds, and I'm a native of Minnesota. And Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, and what I realized is that the lake is a really good metaphor for the free and open internet. And so for people out there who have been trying to explain to their friends and their family why net neutrality is so important, it's kind of like this. Right now, we could all walk down Lake Street and we could go to Lake Calhoun and we could frolic and play in the water, we could run around, we could walk around. And without net neutrality, it's kind of like if I had a bike and I was riding my bike down Lake Street and this limo pulls up and these three ISP goons get out, beat me over the head, and take away my bike and give me a mule that is lame, okay? Then they bill me $100 for this mule, and then every month thereafter, in order to continue to use this mule, I get to pay $39.99. And then once I ride my lame mule, okay, down to the lake, I get to the lake, and there's a freeway wall that's around Lake Calhoun now. Now, every once in a while, I can peek around the wall and go, oh yeah, there's the lake. But then there's also a skyway level above for everybody who wants to pay all this special money. So I want to also quote James Madison. He was our 4th president, really awesome person. He struggled in his heart his whole political career between giving too much power to the federal government and states' rights. Now, he said this: if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. So the point is, obviously you guys aren't perfect, but gosh, Comcast definitely isn't. What they did in 2007 and then what they got out of because they found that little loophole, it's so unjust. And for people who don't know, the FCC tried to do the right thing. They tried to put the government smackdown, so to speak, and say, hey, this isn't okay, this is wrong. And if you think about other good companies, you know, when in a true capitalism you vote with your money, in a true democracy you vote with your voice, but in a true capitalism we would have a different choice. We would have different companies, and they would be good providers of the internet, and we wouldn't even be here. So while the government isn't perfect and neither are the companies, if we just think in terms of the FCC regulating greed and protecting us from greed, if we think about it like that, then we won't have to worry so much and just remember to vote.
Now, the FCC did come out then as a result of listening to citizens and all kinds of organizations. They did come out with a regulation whereby they would be able to, in their estimation, to be able to exert control over companies such as Comcast with regard to the internet and to net neutrality. However, when that was issued, it's my understanding and recollection that Verizon actually sued them, and then it was changed, and so that ruling that came forward to protect net neutrality actually then was watered down. Well, now here we are in front of Congress, and now they're talking about Comcast with the big merger. So a citizen has to be very engaged in understanding how all this operates, because on the one hand you have the regulation, which is to try to modify the behavior of the companies to protect the consumer. On the other hand, then you've got corporations that are trying to figure out how can they get an end around that, and maybe, well, if they just buy up a couple of their competitors, well, then, you know what, that'll solve the problem anyway. So that's kind of at the crux that we are at. Now, the next citizen who gets up to speak at this forum, he's talking about it from the perspective of the local citizen group that is trying to have their voice be heard because they don't have a lot of money, and they are trying to communicate with those outside of their little circle so that they can bring about change in their community. Let's listen in. Let's listen in.
For 12 years, we've worked with community organizers around the country, helping them to use technology to do their work better, more easily, with better results. For us, the story of the last 12 years has been the story of the internet. Today, there are almost no technologies that we're using that don't touch the internet in some way. And I can attest to the power of the internet for communities and community organizing. Let me give you a really concrete example. There's an environmental group in Kentucky who've seen really dramatic growth in their membership over the last several years. Being in Kentucky, one of the big issues is the negative impact that coal mining has had on communities in the state. Their growth has gone hand in hand with their increase in online communications. Email lists, their website, and now blogging, social media, and online video. What it's meant is that they've been able to reach out and connect their local communities with supporters across the country, and in doing so, they've taken a local issue and helped people across the country understand the impact of the energy decisions that we make. They depend on net neutrality to make that work. Without a content-neutral internet, their efforts would never have gotten off the ground, because as a small community group, they simply don't have the resources to pay for privileged access. So affirming net neutrality is critical, because without it, our communities won't have the ability to tell their stories and know that they'll be heard. If we don't codify net neutrality, we'll silence the voices of communities and small organizations across the country. Let me say one more thing. The internet has been a content-neutral network from the beginning. It was designed that way because the initial designers believed in the power of simple networks. Their design meant that regardless of what was being transmitted, the actual technology didn't have to work terribly hard to make any decisions. It was just a transmission layer. The simplicity and lack of centralized control is what made the internet the powerful tool that it is today. By codifying net neutrality, all we're doing is putting into law what has always been the heart and the power of the internet. Transmission of anything to anywhere, regardless of what it is. So for me, the bottom line is this. Fundamentally, I think net neutrality is a question of freedom, and I want an internet that is as free as this country is. Thank you.
And he makes the point that these organizations, the grassroots organizations, are not able to pay for privileged access. And that is what is at the heart of net neutrality, is to ensure that everybody has the same type of speed and access, and it isn't dependent upon the size of your pocketbook. Now, I understand we have a caller on the line, so let's take our caller, questions or comments.
Mayor Longrie, thanks for doing a show on this very significant issue for the future of freedom, future of having a voice in a democracy, and many other things that this issue is very important. Now, of course, Comcast's name isn't only Comcast, but it's Comcast NBC. And, of course, everybody knows what NBC is. The powerhouse media giant, which has for years decided what is important and what isn't important in the international, national, and local news area. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, also we know that Comcast, because they have a monopoly, they have all kinds of lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Also, we know that the news media and the media in general is very significant for the election of, for sure, federal representatives. So when these guys in Washington, as you have shown, make this such a complex issue, try to put it in such large, complex concepts and words, it makes it very hard for people to get an understanding. So thanks for really making it simple as it really is. My question is, how we know how money plays in D.C., in the state of Minnesota. How in the world, when NBC is involved, when Comcast is involved, how can we ever really expect the Internet to really be free again? I mean, do we have such courageous, noble representatives in Washington that they, in the end, are actually going to fight against NBC? Will they actually be there to fight another day? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question, caller. And this is an election year for Senator Franken. And so I would call on the voters to watch how he lives up to his words, because his comments I am very pleased with. I hope that he is and continues to be the champion for the citizens on this issue that he has presented himself to be. But voters have to watch and find out whether or not if he continues down that track. Now, for instance, where is our Representative Betty McCollum on this issue? I have no idea. I have not found any film footage of her coming out and proclaiming her position either way. I have never heard her speak on net neutrality and whether or not she views it as something important for citizens. I've never heard her talk about the importance of protecting public access TV. I have never heard her talk on any of these issues because, why? I have no idea. But I think it's important to watch the elected officials that are up for election this fall and ask them some of those pointed questions and see if they can give you an answer based upon the kinds of film footage that you'll see in this program and in past programs. I would be willing to bet that some of our viewers perhaps know a little bit more about this topic than some of our Congress people do. But anyway, let's continue on with next. Let's take a look at the next clip. Let's go to clip 5. And clip number 5 is where we have a gentleman talking at that FCC forum that was a few years ago, but he's talking about the importance of net neutrality to the small business owner. And after all, don't all of our elected officials say that they are working hard for the little business owner, the little guy? Well, now here's what they should be working on for the little guy. Let's take a look.
My name's Jeffrey Bowes. I'm from St. Paul. I've worked with medium and small family-run businesses for 20 years, mostly in the power sports sector, which tends to be a family-run business. They work very hard to compete against bigger companies, the Amazons, the big multi-line auto type dealerships, but they work on very slim margins. They don't have the deep pockets that their larger competitors do. So the kind of funding that would be required to keep the access open to them through the lack of net neutrality would really impact these businesses. We've also found that in this economic climate that we've been told that small businesses are what's going to save our economies, medium-sized businesses. If we don't have this as a leveling field for them, we will probably lose many of them for that application because there's so many costs in these businesses. You have flooring financing for inventories and all the other advertising, and that's just another bill that actually comes out to be double dipping because they're paying for their internet access and then they're having to pay again to get a priority. They call it web optimization. It's already been banned and checked in various places. FCC slapped Comcast with it about 2 years ago, I think it was. They made a ruling, and you can't do that. You can't stop businesses from growing. And hopefully, as we move through this economy, let's hope that private companies such as Google and Verizon, who have no right to decide what has always been a level and equalizing field, but not only for businesses, but free speech. We can't afford this, not in the past when you think of payola going all the way back into the early radio days. We can't afford it now, not in these tough times, but in the future as we recover and try to compete all over the world in this economic global business that we're being told we have to be part of. Thank you.
He brings up the point about competing, the little company competing in the global economy. And the internet is one way, one tool that the small business has in order to be able to reach more customers other than just those in their locality. Cable access is important for public access TV programming such as Off the Record News and our program. We also replay it at SPNN, which is the St. Paul Neighborhood Network. And a public access TV is partnering more and more with internet access so that our programs, we're putting them on YouTube so that people can watch them not only on cable TV, public access channels, but also on the internet so that you can reach more people. Not everybody has public access TV and has cable to watch public access TV. But if it's available through the internet, it's another way to reach people. And the franchise agreement is one way that the local cable commissions can negotiate with Comcast. But as you heard in a previous program a few weeks ago, is that sometimes Comcast will take the heavy hand with a cable commission and say, this is all we want to negotiate, and then the cable commission has to decide, are they just going to take it or are they actually going to pursue other avenues and fight for what is right for their community, such as in the Roseville viewing area.
I'm the executive director of the St. Paul Neighborhood Network, SPNN. We're the community media center producing public and educational access television in St. Paul. But we also provide media and technology training and production services to our community. We work with a diverse community of non-commercial media producers. They're young people, they're seniors, they're people of all ethnicities and beliefs within our community. And as part of our mission, we also lead the Community Technology Empowerment Project, which is the AmeriCorps program that works to improve digital literacy here in the Twin Cities. You may be familiar with it because it was one of the models for your own digital literacy corps, which you're promoting as a part of the National Broadband Plan. So I want to welcome you here tonight to the friendly confines of Minneapolis-St. Paul. I'm concerned about maintaining free and open access to the internet as a media producer that works with other independent producers who seek to meet the information needs of Americans in our communities. The independent producers we work with distribute video programs through cable, but they're increasingly interested in online access to audiences. There are individuals and community groups that don't have large sums of money to negotiate distribution deals, and they don't have the ability to make agreements with major corporations so their content can be seen. In the cable environment, we already deal with this question in terms of video compression and channel allocations as we try to reach audiences. These issues can be determined actually not by the producers of content, but by the cable corporations that control access to viewers. At best, that kind of issue can be discussed through the venue of local cable franchising, but in the case of the internet, that is just not true. The public needs to have some type of authority intervening in the interest that they have regarding connectivity and access. That's why my organization and others like mine as community media centers are devoted to ensuring that all Americans have the communication tools necessary to connect with others, to learn, to inspire, and to create. And without a free and open internet ensured with access to all by federal policy that you help shape, the ability of our producers to reach audiences will be greatly diminished. Thank you.
After this forum, a year or so or 2 years went by, and there was hearings then at the House of Representatives about net neutrality and about the FCC ruling, putting restrictions on basically increasing the pay to play scenario that you've heard many of these citizens be concerned about, that you have to pay an extra added fee for increased speed or increased access over everybody else. Now, let's take a look at our next clip.
Mr. Turner, we appreciate your willingness to come in and testify. Mr. Turner, if you want to go ahead and start, Research Director for Free Press. We welcome you here, and we look forward to your testimony, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Eshoo, members of the committee. On behalf of Free Press and the Free Press Action Fund, as the coordinator of the Save the Internet Coalition, representing more than 800 groups and their 10 million members, I appreciate the opportunity to offer the perspective of Internet users in today's hearing on House Joint Resolution 37. Let me begin by acknowledging an often forgotten truth. The principle of non-discrimination, which is the bedrock of net neutrality policy, was not always the political football it is today. Unfortunately, the debate around non-discrimination has become immune to the calming powers of historical fact and susceptible to the ills of special interest politics and false partisan frames. This recent rhetorical drift is very much at odds with the long bipartisan effort to prevent market power abuses by owners of our nation's critical communications infrastructure. It was the Nixon administration that put in place strong rules of non-discrimination in order to ensure abuses of market power would not stifle the growth of an infant network computing industry. And this successful framework was later improved upon by both the Carter and Reagan administrations. In the Telecom Act of 1996, a bipartisan Congress recognized that in order to foster new industries, we needed the FCC to act to ensure that everyone had open access to the information superhighway. Look no further than Section 10 to see that Congress intended non-discrimination survive any deregulation. In the early 2000s, the FCC began to abandon the Telecom Act's blueprint for reasoned deregulation through forbearance. However, the Commission still recognized that the underlying non-discriminatory outcomes were worth preserving. SEC Chairman Michael Powell first articulated the 4 Internet freedoms that subsequently served as the basis for the open Internet provisions in the COPE Act, adopted by the House in 2006. And Chairman Kevin Martin took action in 2008 to stop Comcast's secret discrimination against certain Internet content.
The question is, if the FCC is not allowed to regulate companies such as Comcast and how they offer their products to consumers, such as the Internet, and require that if you want to have special access that you have to pay an additional fee on top of the fee you're already paying. If the FCC cannot and is not allowed to regulate, then should it be on the other flip side of the coin that Comcast then not be allowed to merge with Time Warner or any other company so that they become bigger? Because if they become bigger and there's no regulation, then the monopoly can go basically hog wild. Let's continue on with the rest of the comments from this gentleman.
Shared goal of preserving the open Internet. The problem of market power in communications networks is very real and increasingly politically inconvenient. As a result, we've seen those who used to recognize this problem abandon those views. Some policymakers now seem resigned to the misguided notion that the duopoly internet access market is perfectly competitive. This is unfortunate because I believe we all agree that the internet should be preserved as an open platform. Allowing gatekeepers to erect barriers to speech and commerce is an unacceptable outcome, and public policy should be used to prevent it. If we can agree that ensuring access to an open platform is a worthy policy goal, then we have a duty to confront the reality that network owners have strong incentives to close the platform and favor their own content at the expense of everyone else's. Now, I recognize that some of you are uncomfortable with the FCC's open internet order. My organization, too, ultimately opposed it. We felt that it failed to adequately preserve and protect the open internet. However, we oppose the resolution of disapproval. It will leave consumers completely unprotected. It will remove the limited certainty that the FCC's rules provide. And most importantly, it will prevent the FCC from addressing blatant censorship and anti-competitive activities in the future. This resolution is an unnecessary and dangerous overreaction to a policy framework that is at its core very similar to the bipartisan COPE Act of 2006. And make no mistake, adoption of this resolution will increase market uncertainty and harm economic growth. Most ISPs have told Wall Street the truth, that these rules are no burden. So to borrow a very tired old phrase, the resolution of disapproval is a solution in search of a problem. Innovators in the applications and content sector believe they now have a certain, albeit imperfect, framework to live under. This resolution, if enacted, will remove that certainty and subject them to the discriminatory whims of the ISPs. There may be much to dislike about what this FCC did and how it did it. But the fundamental point here is that we cannot simply set up a false choice between what the FCC did and no policy at all. We can't wish away the concentrated market structure. We can't simply hope that the duopoly ISPs will make decisions in the best interest of all Americans. I am a strong believer in free markets, but I understand the immovable barriers to effective competition in markets like this that have natural monopoly characteristics. Internet users cannot afford for Congress to remove what little oversight is left. So instead of pursuing this perilous path, we urge this body to remember its commitment to protecting non-discrimination and work on constructive solutions that will benefit all Americans. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Turner, thank you for being here today. We appreciate your testimony.
We can't wish away the monopolistic structure. Interesting comment. You can't put your head in the sand on this one. Now let's fast forward, and we're going to be looking at testimony that was at a House hearing in Washington, D.C. on May 8th, 2014, talking about the Comcast merger with Time Warner. And so many of the comments and concepts that we've heard from the film footage from the previous years will now suddenly all bubble up again and are present as part of the discussion as to whether or not Comcast should be allowed to get bigger. So let's jump ahead to clip number 8B. And this is the Vice President of Comcast as part of his opening statement, basically telling the Congress people there at the hearing that we are a great company and everything is okay. Don't worry about the merger. Let's take a look.
Just some of them very briefly. Americans are benefiting today from robust competition. 97% of the homes in America are in census tracts where at least 3 competitors offer fixed or mobile broadband internet services. And almost 99% of American homes have access to at least 3 multi-channel video providers. Objectively, this transaction is very straightforward from an antitrust perspective. As Ranking Member Johnson said, our 2 companies don't compete for customers anywhere. It's a fact that every customer will have the same choices among broadband and video providers after this transaction as before. Nor will Comcast gain undue power over programmers. Last week, we announced a transaction with Charter to divest almost 4 million customers, thereby reducing the number of our customers to approximately 29 million, below a 30% share of the multi-channel video subscribers.
There he mentioned that they're divesting a number of their customers to Charter. Well, we happen to be in that group of customers. And we can see that the impact it's had on the negotiations for some of the franchise agreements, and that Comcast really doesn't have a horse in the game. So when they're negotiating, they just want to stick with their negotiation stance, and they don't have to worry about whether or not if they're going to have to work on a continued basis with the various commissions, because, well, quite frankly, they're going to be gone in a short time, and they really don't care. So they don't have to worry about their ongoing relationship with those commissions as a result of the negotiations going on currently. Next, then, we have some representatives asking Mr. Cohen some questions.
Respond to claims that Comcast NBCU has blocked certain content providers like Univision Sports from being carried on your services, or unfairly placed channels of other content providers like Bloomberg News because they compete with NBCU channels.
So two very different questions, but the answer would be the same to both, which is I would deny those charges. I think they are not true. In terms of the way we treated Bloomberg News, the irony of the Bloomberg News situation was that Bloomberg News was positioned in the place it was on the channel lineup before we owned CNBC, so there couldn't have been any discriminatory intent. But I don't even want to rely on that argument anymore. We had a dispute with Bloomberg News. It was resolved at the FCC. We have now repositioned Bloomberg News to news neighborhoods as they have requested.
What about
and we have resolved that matter entirely.
All right. Would you care to respond to the claim about Univision Sports?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was worried about the time, but I'm happy to do that.
And I was going to go there in my line of questioning,
Okay.
too.
I'll quickly say we carry 8 Univision networks. Univision has come to us, and they have asked for additional carriage of 3 Univision networks, and we are under discussions with them. We are one of the largest, if not the largest, carrier of Hispanic programming.
What about
58 channels. So we will resolve on a business matter, we will resolve our issues with Univision in due course.
All right.
Of course, you never admit fault, but it was still something that went to litigation and was then resolved. So now let's take a look. Let's go to clip number 8.3.
I don't want to sound hostile to this merger, because I really think that the government needs to stay as much out of the business world as possible. But I have had some concerns raised by constituents, and one of my concerns is that I learned last week that a combined Comcast Time Warner cable will serve 91% of the Hispanic households in the U.S. and will be the top distributor in 19 out of the 20 top Hispanic marketers. We know that you guys own Telemundo, one of the current providers of Spanish language programming. And along with what Mr. Johnson was asking, what assurances can you give us that you won't discriminate against non-Comcast, NBC Universal owned programming produced by other companies, and do you have internal procedures in place to prevent that kind of discrimination?
So I should have waited for your follow-up. I would have been able to give a more...
The reason I played this clip, because it shows a line of thought that actually will end up in a rabbit hole. The representative, while I know he's well-meaning, he's asking, what assurances can you give us? What internal procedures do you have in place to ensure that this type of discrimination doesn't occur? Except that, how is he going to follow up on the assurances that he's given? What kind of accountability can be put in place to make sure that whatever assurances they're given that day are actually followed through on? Talking about internal measures, internal processes, a company is free to change their internal processes any day, any time they want. It's not set in stone. And while I appreciate his comments that he thinks that the government shouldn't be involved in business, well, yes, government would never be involved with setting internal processes for the business, but that's where that issue of the FCC regulation comes into place, because either Congress has to exercise their authority and say no go to the merger, or they have to authorize the FCC the ability to be able to regulate what Comcast is doing in the market as it pertains to consumers. It has to be one or the other. But this idea of asking for assurances, that's a hollow conversation to be had, because whatever assurances they may give you at that hearing, they don't need to follow up on, and there's no accountability in place. Let's take a look at our next clip. This is where we have a gentleman who is an antitrust attorney who is testifying in front of Congress. Let's listen to his comments.
Mr. Grunis, we invite you to testify.
I practiced antitrust law for about 25 years, and about half of that time I was with the antitrust division. Now, Comcast and Time Warner Cable say they don't compete for subscribers, and you've heard that this morning. But the fact is that Comcast and Time Warner Cable do compete. That's what Brian Roberts, the Comcast CEO, told the Senate Judiciary Committee in Comcast's last mega merger with NBC Universal. And Mr. Roberts was right. The two companies compete in a number of ways. For instance, they compete to carry local and regional sports teams, and they compete for advertising dollars. Mr. Chairman, to help illustrate how sports programming in particular would be abused post-merger, I would ask unanimous consent to submit for the record an article by former Bush administration official Brad Blakeman. The article explains in detail the impact of the merger on sports and sports fans, and it's highly relevant here.
This is an issue that came up several times during the hearing, is the impact of mergers and monopolies on being able to play sports programming, and whether or not viewers are able to have access to watch sports programming. Now, let's continue on with our next clip and hear some more of his comments.
Cable advertisers, they will have less choices if this merger goes through, including smaller local advertisers in your districts who may get shut out entirely. Now, Comcast says that people have a multitude of choices for how they get broadband. You've heard that here today. But at an investment conference in 2011, Mr. Roberts said that Comcast had only one broadband competitor. He was talking about Fios, which was and still is in only about 15% of Comcast's territories. This merger is very likely illegal. The parties know it. That's why they're here talking about how they plan to fix it. But I'm here to tell you what they won't, why it's illegal, and why the fix doesn't cut it. This time it's different. Let's talk about video first, since I think that's the easiest. They want to put together Comcast content with Time Warner Cable's wires. The antitrust theory here is that after the merger, the company would have both the ability and the incentive to withhold NBC and sports programming from rivals such as the satellite companies, the telcos, other cable systems. That would drive up their competitors' costs and make them less competitive. That is called input foreclosure in antitrust jargon. Is it a radical theory? No. It's right out of the Comcast NBCU complaint that the Antitrust Division filed in 2011. But this time it's worse.
So I think he gets to the point, is that they can withhold content so that it can't actually be shown anywhere else. So the viewer, the consumer, has only one place they can go for the content, and that's talking about content. And of course, we've already talked extensively about the concept of net neutrality, which again is another facet of this. Let's continue with his comments.
The even more serious issue of broadband. Comcast and Time Warner Cable's shares of the broadband market are much higher. We haven't heard the witnesses talk about what those shares are, but by some estimates, they're 50% or even more. So what's the problem? Simple. Online video distributors like Netflix, according to the Antitrust Division, are likely to be the best hope for additional video programming competition in Comcast and Time Warner Cable's territories. If Comcast can get hold of about 50% of broadband subscribers through this merger, it puts itself into a position to influence how this new form of competition will play out. The antitrust theory here is called customer foreclosure. You had input foreclosure, this is customer foreclosure. Keep innovative competitors from being able to connect with their audience or charge them so their costs go up. Again, this is not a radical theory. It was mentioned as a concern in the 2011 Comcast NBCU complaint. It's very similar to a theory that the division, the Antitrust Division, actually litigated and won in the D.C. Circuit in the Microsoft case. The same analysis has been applied in other cases where the Internet is threatening an old business model. The key point is that a legitimate role of antitrust is to keep the pathways for innovation open. There's also a buyer power theory which is discussed in my written testimony. Finally, a word about remedies. If, as I believe, the merger is anti-competitive, the best remedy is simply to say no. Behavioral remedies don't work well. In fact, Professor John Quokka, who studied empirically how well they work, said they're disastrous on the whole. They don't prevent prices from going up. Partial divestitures, such as shedding subscribers, also often fail. In this case, where Comcast would pick up New York and LA and other markets, it's likely to try to keep the most profitable subscribers and the most profitable markets and divest the others. That will not restore lost competition, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
He mentioned Netflix being competition for Comcast with regard to content and also with regard to market share. Now, that question of Netflix came up in this hearing because Netflix, in order to have access to the broadband so that they can get to their consumers that are watching movies via the internet, they had to pay a fee, an extra fee, to Comcast in order to make it happen. So let's go to clip number 10 and hear how this plays out.
Is the suggestion that we've heard that Comcast's internet interconnection agreement with Netflix is a sign the market is working well. Is that necessarily the case?
I would argue it's a market that was distorted due to monopoly power. Netflix entered that agreement because it was the only way it could provide connectivity and content to its customers. Comcast controls the only pipe to those customers, and Netflix had to pay the toll to get to those customers, ultimately raising its prices.
Thank you.
The consumer, in the end, had to then pay more to Netflix because Netflix had to pay the toll to Comcast. Now, some would argue that that's the way that business operates, except that prior to that, Netflix didn't have to pay that toll, and they were able to use the access to the internet and use the internet as the platform for which to provide their product to the customers who wanted to view their movies.
Comcast is not likely to foreclose online video distributors because online video is an increasingly valuable part of the broadband internet business. What kind of a response do you have for that inquiry?
Well, Comcast is first and foremost a video company, and it's facing competition, new competition from outside of its traditional business. According to the Department of Justice in the NBC Universal complaint, Comcast took action against that new form of competition. And in my view, this merger only makes that more likely and likely to be worse.
That goes to that issue then of net neutrality that we've been discussing, the importance of having it open and accessible to companies of all sizes, to citizens of all status, because that is a way that we have come to communicate with other people within our community and within the world. And so whether or not, if it's for a business purpose so that your small business can sell whatever it is you have to people clear across the world, or whether or not you're an innovative cloud-based technology company that is utilizing the cloud technology as a way to provide service to your customers, the internet, the broadband, and cable is all intertwined and very important to what we do in the future. Let's continue on with the rest of the comments from this gentleman.
In your view, how effective have the behavioral remedies imposed in the Comcast NBC Universal transaction been, and should similar remedies, in your view, apply in this case?
Thank you for the question. Generally speaking, behavioral remedies are like regulation, and just like regulation, behavioral remedies often don't work. There are problems with them. The problems can include evasion by the parties who are being regulated. I'm not going to get into an argument with Comcast about whether it has or has not evaded certain of those remedies, but that's a problem. There's a problem with unforeseen circumstances. We've heard a little bit about that today in the sense of the remedies appeared to cover the FCC's open internet order, but Comcast went outside of that allegedly and made issues out there.
Where I come down on it is I believe that the merger should not be allowed, because if the FCC is not allowed the ability to properly regulate, then they should not allow Comcast or any other similar company to get bigger. So with that, I want to thank you for watching this episode of Off the Record News. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion and the film clips, and you may come away with a few questions of your own. And if you do, I suggest that you contact your federal legislators and find out where they stand on the issue, what they can tell you about the issue, and what they're going to do about the issue. So with that, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.